I think it's an important question to ask why we're obsessed with the end of the world, and this is true if you go right back in history, certainly looking at ancient Near East texts, right through the beginning of the Christian era, obviously texts in the Hebrew Bible like Ezekiel, like Daniel, things like the book of Revelation in the New Testament. Now when we talk about apocalypse in a contemporary setting, we often sort of think about the Bruce Willis film, The Great Catastrophe, end of the world disaster. But when we go back to the original text, we see that that really isn't what apocalypse means. It's not a catastrophe, it's not something to be avoided. These are texts which tend to be written by persecuted groups. Apocalypse simply means an unveiling. So for the group who writes the text, it's a revelation of the way in which the world really is. The curtain is pulled back, as it were, and they see that God is in control. They see that while they're persecuted in the here and now, as God unveils his plan for history, they will be vindicated and they will attain salvation, they will obtain some kind of victory, whether in time or after the destruction of time itself. Now, you might ask why I, as a historian, am interested in looking at these apocalyptic texts, because really one of the bizarre truisms of looking at apocalyptic history is that every apocalyptic prediction that you look at has been proven to be false. Everybody is wrong. So why look at the history of failure? And of course, you might well think, well, that's totally pointless, but really any belief, no matter how strange, no matter how often it's proven to be wrong, comes with consequences. And certainly when you look at the impact that apocalyptic belief has had, no matter that it's constantly failed, what you find is it being repackaged, you find it being reused in new ways, in new political situations, to emphasize different key theological and political ideas to help develop the different religious identities of particular groups. So to use one example from the sort of text that we have here in Manchester, if you go back and you look at some of the first Bibles that were produced in the early Reformation period, what you find there is texts which were produced in a society in which vast numbers of people expected the end of the world. And those include the big guns of Reformation history, people like Luther, like Melanchthon, and obviously many on the Catholic side as well. So if you go to these Bibles, you find these incredible pictures, these woodcuts in the book of Revelation in these texts. And what Luther and the other reformers have done is that they have taken the Pope out of the contemporary political context, and they've made him the Antichrist. So you have pictures of the whore of Babylon in a papal tiara, or the beast of Revelation as the Pope himself. So these ideas, which are very abstract, ancient textual ideas, are used in a very contemporary political context to make key theological, key political points which help change that society. And of course the Catholic Church fired back. They did exactly the same. They make Luther the beast with 7 heads in the book of Revelation. Now, I find that absolutely fascinating, and I think if we trace apocalyptic themes right through the 16th, 17th, 18th century, right up until a contemporary context, we find ideas taken from the book of Revelation still being used to justify things like US foreign policy, justify particular acts of terrorism. We just need to look at things like the Branch Davidian siege at Waco in 1993, or the Heaven's Gate suicides, to see the way in which these ideas work out not only amongst society as a whole, but also amongst particular religious groups. And then, of course, we need to look at ourselves and our own society. We continue to be fascinated by this topic. We continue to produce films and video games and websites speculating on conspiracies behind the end of the world, speculating on when it's going to happen, how it's going to happen, and whether indeed we could cause it ourselves. Now, if you look at the difference between the understanding of apocalypticism in, say, the 16th century and today, you see a very fundamental change in that when we look at it in the past, apocalypse was something to be celebrated because it was vindicating those persecuted groups. Today, apocalypse is something to be avoided. It's something to be frightened of. But whether we think it's going to be a good thing or a bad thing, it's something we're absolutely obsessed with in contemporary culture. And I think tracing the history of that is one of the most fascinating things that we can do.